Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on the economics of regenerative soil health systems for cotton in Georgia. My name is Gaylon Morgan, and I'm the Director of the Agricultural and Environmental Research Division at Cotton Incorporated. If you're not familiar, Cotton Incorporated is a research and promotion arm of the U.S. cotton industry, and we support applied research and outreach efforts across the cotton belt. In 2015, the U.S. cotton industry developed some lofty sustainability goals for improving soil health through the adoption of soil health practices, and these are essential to meeting these sustainability goals. At Cotton Incorporated, we work closely with the Soil Health Institute on numerous research and outreach projects, including the one you will hear about today, the U.S. Cotton Fund project, U.S. Cotton Regenerative Fund project. If you are not familiar with the Soil Health Institute, the Soil Health Institute is a 501c3 nonprofit organization whose mission is to safeguard and enhance the vitality and productivity of soils through scientific research and advancement. Today, I'm excited to moderate the third of several webinars. The webinar is an outcome of the U.S. Regenerative Cotton Fund led by the Soil Health Institute, with a mission of empowering cotton growers and their trusted advisors with tools and information and networks they need to successfully adopt regenerative soil health systems. In today's seminar, we're fortunate to hear from SHI Soil Health Educator Jessica Kelton and Research Soil Scientist Dr. Dianna Bagnall. During today's presentation, Jessica will be highlighting the findings from the partial budget analysis, which will provide Georgia cotton farmers with the economic information they need to make decisions on the adoption of soil health management systems. Lastly, a few items about today's event. The presentation is being recorded and will be shared with everyone after the webinar is completed, along with the accompanying fact sheet. If you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can upvote questions that you'd like to have prioritized, and Dianna and Jessica will address them live at the conclusion of the presentation. Also, if you would like the captions on, those can be enabled by clicking on the three dots on the toolbar and navigating to captions. With that, I will hand things over to Jessica Kelton to dig into today's content. Thank you.
Thanks, Gaylon, and we appreciate you being here today to moderate, and we appreciate everyone joining today's webinar, the U.S. Regenerative Cotton Fund's Economics of Regenerative Soil Health Systems in Cotton in Georgia. So before I start, I really want to say thank you to two colleagues, Dr. Archie Flanders. He's our agricultural economist. He did the partial budget analysis as well as developed the economic fact sheet that you'll have today, as well as my counterpart, Emily Ball, the other soil health educator for the U.S. Regenerative Cotton Fund. And I know that Dr. Morgan mentioned this, but just to kind of give you an understanding of the objective of the partial budget analysis and those fact sheets, really just to be able to give growers another resource to look at the economics of adoption of these soil health management systems, specifically from a regional perspective. So if you're a cotton grower in Georgia, how can this impact my bottom line for cotton production in the state? So the approach for the economic analysis, we interviewed 8 cotton growers in Georgia who had adopted these soil health management systems for at least 5 years to obtain their production information. Really want to point out that we were looking at their production information and we weren't necessarily asking for their financial information. But then based on that production information, Dr. Flanders was able to calculate those partial budgets to be able to do a comparison of the benefits and costs before and after these growers adopted soil health management practices. And only the differences between these management systems are included in a partial budget analysis. For example, if a grower had an herbicide program that they used before they adopted the soil health management systems and then continued to use those same herbicide applications after adoption, then those zeroed out and weren't included in the analysis. It's also important to note that the revenue was calculated using a standardized set of long-term average prices. We know commodity prices fluctuate. To try to minimize any impact on the bottom line, we use that standard long-term average price. It's also really important to note that we didn't include any kind of EQIP payment or any kind of USDA incentive payment to adopt any of these practices, or any private incentive payments. Those are not always going to be permanent, so we wanted to make sure that that wasn't included in the analysis either. Just to kind of give you an idea of where the cotton producers were across the state, here's the locations of those individual farms. You kind of notice that a significant number of those growers were in the southern part of the state. If you're not familiar with Georgia, it is a relatively warm state with quite a bit of rainfall, between 40 to 60 inches of rainfall a year, 60 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Average temperatures. Also, if you're looking at this map, then it's probably obvious to you, but a lot of the growers involved in these interviews reported having either a clay loam or a sandy loam soil. So keep that in the back of your mind as we go through some of these analysis. Because of the location, we had quite a bit of cotton acres. So average cotton acres on farm for each grower was 715 acres. But because in the southern part of the state, it's not uncommon to see peanuts in rotation. So an average of 300 acres of cotton, of peanuts, as well as some corn and wheat and soybean, and then also roughly 120 acres of double crop acres. So for an average farm size in acres of 1,439 acres per farm. A little more characteristics about the farms included in these interviews compared to state averages and national averages for some of the soil health management practices, including tillage and cover crop use. All of the growers that were included in this economic analysis reported using strip till. So 68% of the planted acres for those interviewed were in strip till, which is substantially higher than the 36% for the state of Georgia, as well as higher than the national average of 35%. Also for cover crops, 64% of the acres included in this the analysis were planted to cover crops. Again, substantially higher than the average for the state of 18%, and quite a bit higher than the 5% we see across the U.S. planted to cover crops. I'll spend most of the time today going over those findings just to familiarize yourself with this table. It is showing the benefits, those reduced expenses for production, as well as any additional expenses. So that first column would be, the green column is the reduced expenses, and then the red column, any additional expenses when a grower is adopting soil health management systems. And as we'd expect, any grower who's planting a cover crop would have an additional expense for the cover crop seed. But then as we move down this table, just looking at fertilizer amendments, whether because of increased soil organic carbon or better nutrient cycling or increased soil moisture that had allowed for better nutrient availability, growers did report that they had the ability to reduce their fertilizer inputs for cotton production. So we see a little over $22 of reduced expense per cotton acre for when we've adopted a soil health management system. Then moving down, for pesticide inputs, we see $24.14 in a reduced expense per cotton acre under soil health management systems. And if you think about cover crop use, a lot of times we do think of the weed suppression potential for a cover crop. So we expect to see a reduction in herbicide inputs. But I also want to point out that some growers actually reported a reduction in insecticide use as well, because they attributed this to an increase in beneficial insects. So they were able to reduce their insecticide inputs as well. And then I know this was a question for our Texas webinar, so I want to point out, yes, we do see some additional expenses in the pesticide category for soil health management system adoption, and this would be attributed to any herbicides used when a grower was terminating a cover crop. Again, fuel and labor cost. what are we seeing from our reduction in expenses and additional expenses? We actually do see a reduction of approximately $30 for fuel and labor. Again, all of these growers reported using strip till compared to a more intensive tillage operation. So they were able to see a reduction in the fuel usage and the amount of time that it required to manage that cotton. So again, a roughly $30 reduction for fuel and labor by using soil health management systems. So as well as our equipment ownership, we do see a reduction of expenses, roughly $23 of reduction in equipment ownership. And if you think about this, if you're not having to go out there into a field as often and you're putting less trips across the field on your tractor or any of your equipment, then you're able to keep that equipment a little bit longer. Maybe you don't need as much equipment. So a reduction in the equipment ownership cost. We did see some additional expenses when adopting a soil health management system. So you can think of any kind of new equipment that you would need to purchase to implement these practices, whether it's to plant a cover crop seed or for cover crop termination. But then when we look at total expenses combined, we see a reduction of approximately $100 for per acre for total expense reduction in these expenses, as well as roughly $52 for an additional expense. So if we add these together, we still see a reduction from inputs of roughly $47 per acre when a grower transitions from more business as usual practices to those soil health management systems. So moving down the table, looking at additional revenue, again, keep in mind that we used a long-term average to calculate any additional revenue. But for all farms that were included in this analysis, I think it's really important to point out that no grower reported any kind of reduction in yield. We actually had 3 of the 8 farmers who reported an increase in yield once they adopted soil health management systems. So what we see is an average of roughly 72 pounds per acre of cotton, that an increase in yield. And when we calculate this out using that 70 cents, we see a positive change in revenue of around $50 per acre for adoption when adopting soil health management systems. So when we look at this total, we see a positive change in net farm income of $98.23 per acre when those growers were able to implement soil health management systems. And I do think it's really important, again, to underline that, yes, we see approximately $100 in a change of net farm income, but even those growers who didn't report that they had an increase in yield still were able to capture about $48 in reduction in production cost just by implementing that soil health management systems. And again, I think it's really important to note that here, because it can be variable on yields, but even without an increase in yield, growers were still able to see a reduction in the production cost. Again, knowing that we have variability on how this plays out on farm, just to kind of show you individual net farm income changes for all of the growers that were included in this analysis, we see on the low end approximately $30 an acre increase or change in net farm income compared to $180 per acre. Again, on that right-hand side, that's really those growers who are able to see an increase in yield. And so along with the reduction in cost for production, they also got an increase in yield. But it's worth noting here that regardless, every grower that had adopted soil health management systems were able to see a positive net return from using these practices. And this is another area that I want to point out, and I know it's included in the fact sheet, but it's really important to highlight. When we look at all of this, all of the analysis, we're looking at those numbers and being able to put a dollar figure to it. But when we do these interviews, we also ask some questions of growers. It's really harder to quantify, but just as important on farm, like increased crop resilience. 88% of the growers reported an increased crop resilience, whether that's they were able to withstand a drought, or maybe if there's extreme rainfall events, their crops are able to weather those a little bit better. 100% of the growers reported increased field access and improved water quality. We know if you've got a pretty big rainfall event, the water leaving the field that wasn't able to be held by the farm or by that field, it was clear water running off, so you're not losing a lot of soil to erosion. This is the part that I think is really important, thinking back to where these farms were located and the sandy soils. 63% of the growers reported increased soil organic matter. And if you're in those sandier soils where you know it's really difficult to build that organic matter, greater than 50% of the growers interviewed said that they were able to see improved soil organic matter. I think that's really important to note, and really highlights the benefits of these soil health management systems on farm, as well as 63% of the growers reporting that they had an increased public perception of agriculture by the community. I think that's also really important to highlight, but also hard to put a dollar figure on how important that is for farmers. So another thing that I want to point out and talk about is the greenhouse gas emission benefits from soil health management systems. Not my area, not my forte. So we're going to talk about the potential reductions from the growers, specifically the growers that were interviewed for the analysis, but I also want to put it into terms that make sense to me and hopefully will make sense to those who aren't involved in greenhouse gas emissions reductions all the time. So we attribute soil health management systems with its ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So looking specifically at the cotton acres and these 8 farms that we interviewed, looking at their reduced use of diesel fuel, as well as the decreased use of fertilizers and amendments, being able to calculate that out based on the fact that we had 715 acres of cotton, and these growers were using strip till operations compared to more conventional systems. We see that we have an average reduction in emissions of 0.02 metric tons of CO2 equivalent per cotton acre per year. So what does that mean to someone like me, or maybe those who aren't as familiar? That's equivalent to the removal of 48 cars, or the emissions from 48 cars per year from the road. So these 8 farms, just from their cotton acres, converting from a more traditional system to a soil health management system, was able to offset the emissions from 48 cars per year. Now, if you were on a few weeks ago and you listened, I know Dr. Bagnall talked about the reduction from Texas. I think it was over 200 cars per year. If you think about the size of Texas operations compared to Georgia, it makes sense that you'd see more reduction in Texas, but still not an insignificant amount of CO2 equivalent reductions from these 8 farms in Georgia and just their cotton acres. And that's not even including any reductions in diesel fuel or fertilizer on their other commodities on those farms. So just to kind of summarize, and I know I've moved a little bit faster, so maybe we have a few more minutes for Q&A at the end. The 8 farms that we interviewed averaged about 1,439 acres with reduced tillage on 68%, and all of those growers were using strip till operations with cover crops planted to 64% of those acres. Again, really want to point out that no farmer that was interviewed reported any kind of decrease in their cotton yield. And we actually had 3 of the 8 farms that reported an increase of approximately 72 pounds per acre just by converting from more standard practices to soil health management systems. Cost an average of $48 an acre less to grow cotton using those soil health management practices. So not even looking at our increase in revenue potential, we still saw a reduction of $48 per acre by using those soil health management systems. Soil health management systems increase the net income by an average of $98.23. So when we look at the reduction in expenses to produce it, combined with increase in revenue, we see a net farm income, a positive net farm income change of $98.23. And if you're a grower, think about how much you're spending to produce a crop and what your returns are based on our current cotton price. That's not insignificant to see a net farm income of roughly $100 per acre. And that's attributed all to soil health management system adoption. Then also just remembering again that there's those harder to quantify benefits from using those soil health management practices, like the increased resilience to extreme weather, improved access to the fields, improved water quality, and then really specific to Georgia and those sandier soils, the potential to improve or increase that soil organic matter. Just from these farms, what we see is the greenhouse gas emission reduction potential of equivalent to removing 48 cars per year from the road. And then when we think about this in terms of the state of Georgia, looking at the analysis on these 8 farms and adoption rates of conservation tillage at around 62% in the state and cover crops at 18%, you think about how much potential we have to improve profitability in Georgia production if we saw a move towards a higher percentage of conservation tillage adoption and cover crop use. We have a potential to really improve those profitability just by adopting soil health management systems. And I know they mentioned it, Dr. Morgan mentioned earlier that we've already done a few of these economic webinars and release some of those fact sheets, but we can continue to work on developing the economic analysis to some of the other cotton producing states. So if you haven't heard your state represented in one of these webinars or seen the fact sheet, we're going to continue to do that work so that we'll have those fact sheets available to cotton producers in states that we haven't presented that information on yet. So before I close out, I do want to recognize the supporters of the U.S. Regenerative Cotton Fund. Without their support, we wouldn't have the ability to do these the webinars and the fact sheets that hopefully are very valuable to growers, as well as some of our outreach efforts and some of our soil sampling efforts in the cotton world. So again, thank you to those supporters. And I will pass this back over to Dr. Morgan so we can start the Q&A session.
Jessica, thank you very much for that presentation. A lot of good information there, a lot to kind of digest. At this time, I'd like to also welcome SHI's Research Soil Scientist, Dianna Bagnall, to help join in for the Q&A session. Welcome, Dianna. All right, there are a few questions in the queue. One is related to, the incentive payments, and do you think with the current situation, increased potential for payments would make a significant difference? And that could be for Dianna or Jessica.
Yeah, I'll take a shot. We think it was really important to quantify the cost changes independent of those, so that if someone was interested in that incentive payment, they could maybe consider it in additionally. So if, for example, if this was somebody who was looking at payment for some ecosystem services or a change in practice, they could stack it and they had them separated out. And I know that there are growers that are involved in it. So I think whether or not incentive payments in addition to these cost benefits are important to growers probably is a really regional question. So I think sometimes they can be, but we're hoping to show that these practices have financial benefits even in the times when incentives may not be available.
Awesome. All right, there's another question there. Was the farm on the Piedmont Research Farm? So I think they're asking the locations of where the information was collected.
Yeah, all of these are on-farm interviews, so we're working directly with growers. So these are not research farm locations. I don't know. I think we've intentionally kind of not shared the particular farm information. For these growers, we appreciated their time, but we'll keep their particular location more general. But to underline there, we are not looking at a research situation. We're actually looking at production information that farmers were willing to share with us.
Yeah, and then there's another question there about comparison of soil health management practices. And I think what they're asking there is just clarification about how you guys came up with the 146 versus the conventional farmer at $100. So I don't know, Jessica or Dianna, if you could maybe dive into that a little bit more on how you came up with the comparison between those two different farming systems.
Yeah, so anytime we sat down with a grower and for the interview, asked them, what were your production practices before you implemented either a reduction in tillage or cover crop? And so what would you be doing prior to your transition? And then what are you doing now? And so the analysis was done with, okay, maybe you would have made 3 trips across a field versus 1 trip. And that's what the production practices that were captured, and then set a standard using standardized pricing to be able to do a comparison of a business as usual grower would spend X amount of dollars per acre doing this practice, and using soil health management systems, they're using X amount per acre. And if that's not as clear as somebody would like, or they want to dig into it a little bit more, we have that protocol on how it's done on our website, and maybe we can throw that in the chat box so that if anyone wants to go see some specifics, and I know Dr. Flanders would be much better at explaining that, but he put together all that protocol if you'd like to take a look at it.
Right. Thank you, Jessica. Another question kind of related, I think, to the geography is, what were the soil textures for these study areas? And I think you touched on that a little bit, Jessica, in part of the presentation, but you may hit it again.
Yeah, and then Dianna may jump in talking a little bit about it as well. So I look back at the soil types that were reported by the growers. I think 1 or 2 growers reported a clay loam soil, and then others, predominantly it was sandy loam, and then some sandy soils. So if you looked at the map, again, the southern portion of the state really is where a lot of these growers were located. So a lot of sandy loam soils. Anything you want to add to it, Dianna?
No, I think you covered it. And the clue that there's some peanuts in rotation also tell us that these are really sandy soils that most of these growers were working with.
All right. Thank you. There's a question, keeps moving away from me. Was there any estimation of CO2 equivalent removals that came from changing tillage and cover crop management practices?
Yeah, so in this analysis, we do look at the reduction in diesel fuel, and that's almost always a difference in tillage. So it was the change from a more intensive tillage to strip till that drove a lot of those benefits. In terms of cover crops, we typically think of cover crops adding more to the greenhouse gas picture by storing carbon. And we're not thinking about storing carbon quantitatively here, although several growers did say that they had suspected they had higher organic matter, organic carbon. So yes to the tillage, we did account for that in terms of diesel fuel reductions, but not so much on the cover crop side.
All right, kind of along those same lines is, how many practices were included in the soil health management strategies in addition to the changes or reduction in tillage?
So yeah, we were looking at reduction in tillage, also the use of cover crops, and able to kind of capture nutrient management in there. So looking at reductions in fertilizers. So, and it would be great if we could kind of, and to some degree, and I'm not sure, I'll have to go back and look at the specifics for the interviews for those growers, but if growers are implementing livestock into their rotations, we are trying to capture any value for grazing of the livestock as well. But I can't remember if we had any specifics for Georgia.
Okay. There was, let's see, think probably another one would be what practices, oh, that ties in with the other one. Here's one. Did these producers adjust their irrigation schedule or amount as a result of improved soil health? So were there any irrigation modifications, I guess, done with these for those that adopted the soil health practices?
Yes, there are some, depending on the specific farmer. That is a question we try to capture any changes in irrigation where they report less time of turning it on, or if they're able to make their change their irrigation schedule because of using those. Again, I would have to go back and look. I'm not sure if it's put into the fact sheet or not. We do capture it in the individual interviews if there's a reduction in irrigation costs, but I'm not sure if that is a line item that's explained a little more in detail in the fact sheet. But if someone wants to know, I can try to summarize that. If that at the end we can kind of go back and I'll try to touch base with whoever's asking that question.
Okay. There's been some mention of this, but about the soil organic matter. And the question is, was there an average impact and how long did it take for the adopted practice to result in increase in organic matter?
That's a great question. I would love to have a definitive answer for that. I don't know that there's any correlation between years of practice of soil health management practices and seeing the organic matter. Honestly, I would say that the bigger correlation is to what the grower is doing and are they tracking it. I think that's where we really saw that they were reporting that organic matter, that there were some growers who could say, yes, I've been tracking and I've seen an increase of X% during 7-8 years of using this. Some were not that specific. And so it's not something we were able to say, yes, we see, 0.5% increase in soil organic matter. But it would be wonderful if we could actually know what that was. I'm sure there's a lot of growers that would love to know that, but no, we don't have it in this.
Does this data point include scope 1, 2, or 3, or was the data strictly related to scope 1? I guess emissions, right?
Yeah, so I think
That's
that
correct.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think that this is an estimation based on the partial budget analysis. So that's about their production information. So whether or not, this is something that would apply for a particular, incentive program or for a credit program, would really need to make sure that they aligned with whatever guidance those individuals were given. So we're not trying to kind of use this as a carbon market per se, but we are trying to give some reasonable bounds for the amount of reductions that are happening. And so this would be emission reductions that be attributed to the grower, to the farm. And so that would, in terms of the scope, it would be in that place in the supply chain. It would not necessarily be something that could be claimed by another entity. So if we were in a framework where we were accounting for these emissions, we would want them to be claimed by the grower in this case.
All right, I think we've covered at least a good portion of the general questions. I guess there's one here. Are Georgia growers using more no-till systems or more strip-till systems?
For our interviews, all of the growers reported using strip till. And this is just my opinion, and Gaylon, you might jump in here. It makes sense to me that you see more strip till operations compared to some areas like Texas, where a lot of the growers we interviewed were using strictly no-till systems. In my experience, more growers are using strip till when they're planting peanuts, so having peanuts in their rotation. A lot of the growers were using strip till, and that's what we saw was that all of the growers we interviewed used strip till for their cotton production.
All right, one more question. How long was the economics study done? And I think they're asking there is like, what span were you asking the questions regarding your economics?
So yeah, when we interviewed a grower, we were looking at, again, the growers using soil health management systems for at least 5 years. So we were asking, what did your farm operations used to look like? What do they look like currently? So we were trying to capture what their current operations look like, so that we've taken into consideration that 5 years of kind of trial and error. And this is what the current system. So that's what we were capturing, current operations, current management practices versus what it used to look like before they started the transition.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's really good context. And maybe one thing to just note there is that for some of these growers, if they had been using soil health management systems for quite some time, you can imagine that other things in their operations have changed over that time. For example, they might be growing varieties of cotton that are higher yielding than when they started. And so we were careful in the interviews to ask the growers, what they would attribute to differences in soil health. And a lot of them either had other fields that they weren't using these practices on, so they had a comparison, or they had a neighbor who they were working closely with or new production information. So kind of thinking about, yes, may have been a long time frame, but we were aware we need to adjust for differences over time, things like technology changes or changes in genetics.
All right. So Dianna or Jessica, unless y'all saw something in the Q&A that you really wanted to address, maybe we'll kind of cut the questions off there. All right. Well, again, hopefully we covered most of the questions. If you guys have additional questions, feel free to reach out to Jessica directly. Her email address will be included in the follow-up email, which will include the link to a brief survey, this webinar recording, and also the fact sheet that was developed by the Soil Health Institute. I want to thank you all for joining this informative presentation, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again.